As Tom is making his astounding exit on me from the room, full of life, I want to briefly introduce with such gratitude this amazing author, Luther Smith. Hope is here. I have finally done what I do to every book I can't put down. I have baptized it in coffee. So it lets you know how I've continued to read. What I find is the book of encouragement for hopefulness in all of our engagements as we pursue this beautiful balance that Luther calls us to mind of beloved community and justice. And I think you heard it in his sermon this morning. I will say that I think I was perhaps 27, maybe 28, interviewing for a job at Emory University. And the head of the head of the search committee was Luther Smith. And I can tell you that I walked in the room, there was kindness, there was greeting, and there was this man who was holding the space. That was obvious from the moment I walked in. It was wisdom holding the space. He was generous to me. He was very welcoming, and he asked really hard questions about what ministry was, getting Emory to think of ministry for the first time, really, in a profound connection to the city of Atlanta, which he knew very well from his own history with the civil rights movement and his many long years of friendship with Howard Thurman, the amazing intellect and contemplative of a generation of civil rights leaders, including Dr. King when he was at Boston University, where Thurman was the chaplain of the university. He has been for me a stalwart presence and spiritual guide. This book is not his first. He has others about engagement, spiritual life. He has worked to get archives at Emory of Howard Thurman's own works. So we are always indebted to Luther Smith, and totally grateful, Luther, you could be with us this way.
Thank you, Bobby. I have more things to express than I'll have time to express about you, because from the time in which you joined the role of chaplain and then teacher, you have always been a source of caring, of creativity, of joy. I will always remember your sermon where you drew upon the song that said, "My future's so bright, I just gotta wear shades." And so many others. So it's quite a joy to be here where in your time of retirement, you continue to have your spirit overflowing in the formation of persons as well as your own. Yeah, thank you. And I'm thankful to Epiphany itself. I've been in this room many, many, many times because you have provided meeting space for the Interfaith Children's Movement for years. This is no small contribution to us. And until the time of COVID, we were here. And there is something about the availability of the space and the way in which we were welcomed, that Epiphany was really, for us, a place of hospitality that enabled us to do the work that we were doing in advocacy for children. So thank you deeply, deeply for that. I've also been in services in the sanctuary for different events, memorial services. And remind me again, Amy, is it the Sisters of Anne?
Yeah,
Anne?
The Annas.
Society of Anna the Prophet.
Yes, yes. Yes, I was here when Catherine Meeks was being installed. So there are a variety of occasions, so thank you for that. I'll be brief. It's helpful, I think, to have a summary of the book, and what I've heard is, yes, persons welcome time for questions and comments. I've never known Episcopalians to lack wanting time for questions and comments. And I so delight in that because there's more of an opportunity for an exchange. So I'm going to be brief in the summary. Hope is here. What really initiated the research, the collection I'll tell you about, and the writing was meeting with my father after a church service that he attended where the guest minister was preaching from 1 Corinthians 13. And he ended that sermon saying, in light of what's going on nationally and internationally, perhaps for us in this day and time, among faith, hope, and love, the greatest of these is hope. And that blew my father and me away because we had never heard a sermon where the greatest of these is hope. It's always been love. It's followed the text. The greatest of these is love. And I began to think, so what is this greatness of hope? I've never been interested in the idea of trying to decide which is greater, hope or love. That comparison has never interested me. But what is the greatness of hope? And I started to pay attention to how I was hearing the word hope being spoken by persons. And it became evident that usually people are speaking the word hope as a desire. I hope the Braves do better next year. I hope that my grandchildren are able to make it through adolescence without being stupid. I hope. So this matter of desire is one of the ways in which hope is often used. Another is in terms of expectation. The sense in which I really do hope that if they keep working on this understanding of medicine for cancer, this particular disease will be addressed sufficiently. The sense in which there is something beyond what's immediately available that we might be looking forward to. The way in which some people are hoping for a particular outcome in the upcoming election. I'm reserving taking sides at this point in time, but you know how deeply felt that is. No, let me say, I've taken sides, but I'm reserving speaking about it now in terms of taking sides. And wishfulness, desire, wishfulness, expectation for a source of renewal or transformation, a range of things that express what we want to occur, a matter of hearts, desire good things that we hope for, but somehow all of that did not reflect the greatness of hope. And in reading articles, in hearing stories, where people were speaking about the meaning of hope in their lives, I began to discover that hope is something more than just what I want to happen. There's a sense in which that's hopefulness, but it can be that, but it's more than that. It's like the word love is more than the way in which love is often used. We speak of romantic love and infatuation as one expression of love. And we know that's the case, but there's something more to love than that. We speak of, I love ice cream. Wonderful. But we know that the meaning of love is something more than that. And there's a depth to love that I think make the word quite reticent for many people to express. To say, I love you. Because there's so many implications about saying I love you in terms of, let's get it on, or our stuff. Our hesitation that this deeper meaning of love is often lost to us. And even when we say, love your enemies, and I have had so many people say to me, not only I can't do it, I'm not even going to try to do it. And this confusion about loving the enemies means you gotta like your enemies, or it means you gotta trust your enemies. You can love a child and not trust a child. And understanding the deeper meaning of these terms, these words, these virtues that drive our faith is crucial. And consequently, I sought to understand, what is it with hope? And one of the initial insights that came forth is how hope and love are always together. Any understanding of this depth meaning of love entails hope, because I'm defining hope in the book as a force of God that enlivens us to life. This is what hope does. It's a force of God that enlivens us to life. And with love that is also in many ways transforming us in a particular way, to understand that as to how this force of hope is working. And you don't have hope without love in terms of depth meanings. The idea of, I'm going to really give this child a beating in the expectation that when this child recognizes how this child has done something wrong, and I don't want this child to make the mistake in the future, the idea that I'm going to beat this child as an expression of hope for the future, that is missing the significance of love, because from the child's perspective, you didn't just give me a warning. From the child's perspective, you're not only trying to control me, you have abused me. And I will never forget this act of abuse. I may not express it this way, but the child is traumatized by what has happened. Hope and love are always together. And wherever we are wanting to exercise the virtue of hope, it must always occur with the virtue of love. And wherever we are seeking to exercise the virtue of love, it must always occur with the virtue of hope, being enlivened to life, and not just what was expressed when I was growing up about some of the tactics in the Vietnamese War, where they said we had to destroy the village to save it. So they're always together. Hope is a force of God that enlivens us to life. And as a force of God, it's not something that I possess, it's something that possesses me. How do I not just see hope as something to manipulate so that I feel better, but how do I try to understand what is this force of God doing in the world that makes for its greatness? So the other dimension of hope is that it's purposeful. Hope is great, hope is purposeful. And as I characterize in the book, the purposefulness of hope is for beloved community and justice. Beloved community being a community that is characterized by compassion and justice. And a community that is reflecting God's dream for us. Because it can be understood that a biblical narrative from Genesis to Revelation is God's dream of community. That entails nature, that entails neighbors, that entails family, that entails strangers, that entails enemies. God's dream for community. And we hear God's dream for community through the prophets. We hear God's dream for community in terms of the condition of the people in exile and how God is with them, and how God expresses both anger and how God expresses heartfelt desire for their change. We hear God's desire for beloved community through the ministry of Jesus and who Jesus is engaging, going beyond the boundaries of what many feel to be acceptable. How can Jesus be in the company of sinners? How can Jesus be healing on the Sabbath? How can Jesus be interpreting the law in this particular way? And frequently, it's the religious leaders that are most disgusted with Jesus and want to get rid of him. It's religious leaders who can be some of the fiercest opponents you'll ever have. So this force of God that enlivens us to life for beloved community. And the other thing I would say about hope in terms of its greatness and that its purposefulness is that as a force of God, hope is always with us because God is always with us. This force of God, hope and love are always with God. Consequently, the title of the book, Hope is Here. And if hope is always with us, how might we be looking at current realities differently than just waiting for something different to occur that makes us hopeful? How might we perceive possibilities that are in our midst, that are in us, that we will miss if somehow we are only perceiving hope being brought to us by something new, by new persons, by new movements, by new policies. And all of that might be contributing to the work of hope. But to assume that it is somehow now absent is that which I think leaves us more deficient than God has called us to be. And then what the book focuses on are the spiritual disciplines, the practices that enable us to perceive the work of hope and to enact it in us. And I'll quickly say that and then questions and comments. There are 5 major practices that also entail some other spiritual practices, but 5 major ones on which the book focuses. With the understanding that this journey with God is one for which we need to prepare. Oh my goodness, this morning's sermon on journey and preparation and what I'm now saying about hope. This journey with God is one for which we need to prepare. And how are we continually preparing to journey faithfully, to discover I don't need 4 big suitcases and 4 smaller ones. The next time I make this journey, things will be pared down without being burdened in that way. To understand what is needed in terms of maps when you journey and how you relate when you don't have maps. I've had to learn this lesson. As Bobby knows, I continue to have a flip phone. And so I often journey without a map because it doesn't have GPS. And it leads me to relate with people I don't even know in some way because I get lost without. But there are other reasons my flip phone and I have a good relationship. The sense in which knowing what we need, what we don't need, how perhaps some of the things that we have assumed are essential to our lives are really preventing us from having the kind of relationships that God intends for us.
What?
To have the
Can you say that again?
Yes, yes, probably not. But the sense in which if I think I need this and I need that and whatever, and that and this, it's not just that and this doesn't help me with a relationship. Sometimes it gets in the way of even cultivating a relationship. I'll give you an example. When I first moved to Atlanta, it was the first time I was a homeowner. And when the time came for cleaning the gutters, and a ladder was needed to go on the roof, and of course I didn't have a ladder, I looked around to see what neighbors had a ladder. And when the grass needed seeding, I didn't have a seeder, but I looked around to see what neighbors had a seeder. And I decided, I see neighbors with these things. I don't need to buy them. So I want to give my neighbors a chance to be neighborly to me and loan me their ladder when I need it, because I only need to go up there once a year. I only needed to use a seeder once a year. And what I discovered is when I went to ask for a ladder, I had conversations I would not have had if I decided I was going to fill my garage with everything I needed so I didn't have to rely upon a neighbor at all. And I learned about households that were going through the trauma of death and illness, times in which we celebrated and we talked about what we should do in this community in terms of revitalizing matters. The getting beyond simply having a waving and smiling relationship with one another, and knowing one another's names, but also hearing about matters that were upon their heart, and my sharing matters upon my heart that never would have occurred if I wasn't in some way taking the time to ask for a ladder or a seeder. And what I discovered when I went to ask for a ladder, this was not something that took 5 minutes, it was something that usually took 30 to 45 minutes. With follow-up in terms of, so how do we prepare for this journey with the understanding of there are some things that are available to us that may actually not be serving our purpose for being on the journey and the kind of convictions that we have called to live into in terms of beloved community? How do we discern that? How do we discern how that is happening in interpersonal relationships, as well as larger communal relationships, as well as what's happening in the world? And I think the disciplines help us in that kind of discerning. And so the first discipline is contemplative prayer. Contemplative prayer and I suspect, knowing the people you've had at Epiphany and leadership, as I've known over the years, I suspect contemplative prayer is not something that is unknown at Epiphany. And there are many expressions of contemplative prayer, but the one on which I focus on is the importance of creating a space where we listen. We listen, and listen deeply. Not just listen for an answer that we want, but to be listening to how God is guiding us. God is speaking to us in a way that at times it perhaps feels like it comes from beyond us, but at other times it's coming from within us. And this distinction between what comes from beyond and what comes from within, personally, I don't think it merits trying to separate them. For God abides with us and deeply within us. An expression that has been important to me is God is closer to us than we are to ourselves. And this closeness of God, this intimacy of God, how am I listening to how God dwells with me? And in that listening, not just waiting to hear how God is responding to my anxieties and fears, there's time for that, but how am I listening to guidance that may be even different than my petitions and my confession? Because could it be possible that my anxieties and wishes and desires are somehow blocking my attention to things that are deeper than that God is desiring for me? Listening deeply. And then, how do we discern what we've heard? Because it's not just a matter of hearing. It's like, St. Francis, before he was a saint, who really heard Jesus saying to him, repair my church. And St. Francis went about rebuilding churches physically because he thought this is what Jesus was telling him to do. But St. Francis came to realize this isn't what Jesus was asking him to do, to, address the physical matters of the church, but to address the very moral, spiritual foundations of the church, because the church had veered from how God had been calling the church to work in the world. How do you discern? How do we discern what we hear? How do we not only attend to it ourselves, how do we draw upon a spiritual director? How do we draw upon the larger community to do the discerning? And third, how do we enact what we've discerned so that a prayer isn't just heard and understood, but then we don't do anything about it? Abraham Joshua Heschel, the great Jewish scholar and rabbi, said that when he marched from Selma to Montgomery, he felt that his knees and his legs were praying. The sense in which how we engage what we have heard and what we have discerned is enacted. And in this sense, perhaps this is how we pray without ceasing. We're always listening. We're always discerning. We're always engaging. It's kind of like Brother Lawrence, who said when he was doing the dishes, or some have talked about cleaning toilets, it's done with such a sense of prayerfulness that what is occurring as dishes are being done, as meals are being prepared, as toilets are being cleaned, is of no higher standing than when they're in the sanctuary in worship. That kind of prayerfulness, to pray without ceasing. And I say to you, it's hard for me to tell you when I'm not praying, rather than the idea that prayer takes a particular kind of closed time that's very different than all the other times. So that's contemplative praying. The second one is prophetic remembering. How are we remembering the past, especially the prophets around matters of justice and beloved community, especially remembering what Jesus has said to us in guiding us, especially remembering our ancestors? How are we remembering the past? And to get through this quickly, I'll just say there's an assault on us remembering faithfully in this country in our educational system. And forgetting is sinful. And the advocacy to forget, or the advocacy to remember falsely, is that these are spiritual matters. These are not just educational matters. And there's a book by James Loewen that means a lot to me. It's entitled Lies My Teacher Told Me. And in this book, Loewen is conveying how our textbooks have been framed in a way that truly fail to provide a true history, a realistic history of the country. And we don't trust children with that real history. And what does it mean when people grow up either continuing to perpetuate a false narrative about our formation, or when people begin to recognize that they've been given a false narrative and they distrust the whole system through which they've come? The third of these is crossing identity boundaries. What are the sensitivities? What are the virtues? What are the revelations that come with crossing another person's identity boundary? The kinds of things someone defines in terms of their ethnicity or their race or their nationality or their trauma or their gender identity or their sexuality. What does it mean to cross someone else's boundary with a kind of sensitivity that we are working at this matter of understanding and relationship and neighborliness and care and compassion that are part of essential dimensions of beloved community? And what are the things in my identity boundary that I'm sensitive to, such that when someone crosses it and perhaps violates a dimension of my identity, I'm not immediately deciding they're either an enemy or they're so insensitive, I won't have anything to do with them. Because beloved community relies upon us attending to that, and there are not many places where we get any kind of help with that. One of the most fundamental concepts of the term reconciliation is a place of meeting. A place of meeting. Where do we have places of meeting with people who are not like us? You've provided in this room such a place when ICM has met, where we've had Jews, Muslims, Christians, and Baha'i and Hindus meeting together. And I know it's not just been ICM. When it was under the title of FAMA, Faith Alliance of Metropolitan Atlanta, this was a space when people of various religious traditions would have that. And I think reconciliation is so crucial that I don't use the term, because too often, let me say I don't use the term intentionally often, because so often people are using the term reconciliation as if it's once and for all. And I don't think reconciliation is ever once and for all. I prefer the term the reconciling process. How are we involved in a process, one that we will be engaged in all of our lives, maybe even on our deathbed or someone else's deathbed, the sense in which there's this sensitivity of connection and affirmation and reception for strangers, for enemies, for people who are very different for us. As I mentioned in the book, I was part of a group that had gone to Montgomery, Alabama, and they were meeting at Dr. King's church there in Montgomery. And the docent was indicating to this group of young people that came from Candler, the docent was mentioning that earlier she was with a younger group of persons, and there was this, I think she said third or ninth grader, because the person was only like 9 or 10 years old, third or fourth grader, because the person was only like 9 or 10 years old. And when she asked, talking about what Dr. King and the civil rights leaders had been about for the transformation of the country and the world, something from which they were benefiting, she asked, for whom would you be willing to die? And one of the young people who was in like third or fourth graders said, strangers. I'm getting a chill now just repeating it. And I always get this chill when I tell that story. Strangers. It's what we're taught as an act of faith, but I've never heard that response before. I have perceived a witness to it, but I've never heard a person say, this is for whom I'm willing to die. The fourth is transforming conflict. How do we, for beloved community and for justice, how do we transform conflict? Not how we manage conflict, not how we get rid of conflict, because conflict is a symptom. There are deeper issues that are causing the conflict. And if we're only trying to get rid of conflict, which is what a lot of people do, what a lot of leaders do, we're failing to understand that conflict can be creative. You don't get to justice without conflict. Just accepting things. And the most, I think, difficult leadership is leadership that is conflict adverse, that is always wanting to avoid dealing with an issue or dealing with conflict and putting it off. And when you do that, it's not as if somehow or another the symptoms go away. What's really just happened is things fester. So how can we be creative? How can we be, in some sense, trained to deal with conflict creatively that benefits justice, beloved community, relationships? I was talking with the leader of a program for churches that did training in transforming conflict. And he said to me, churches really only call on us when they have a problem, usually around issues of sexuality with the clergy. And when we have addressed that and offered the kind of procedures that could be helping them with a number of other matters in the church, they hardly ever take us up on it. They hardly ever take us up on it. And the last one is, the last spiritual discipline is celebration. Celebrating community. Not just celebrating when there's a victory, but celebrating as an integral part of what we are about, what we are doing. Because we cannot be sustained in the struggle for justice without both anticipating celebration and remembering celebration, as well as being in celebration. We cannot do that. We won't be successful. We'll be overwhelmed by the realities that we face. But these are times of joy. These are times of singing. These are times of good food. These are times of meeting new people. These are times of laughing at some of our conflicts. These are times of being at table with those with whom we've been struggling. These are times where we are listening deeply to one another in ways perhaps we hadn't before. But it's this way in which we practice that I believe helps us to both perceive the immediacy of hope as well as be sustained by the fact that hope is always with us, that hope is here. I'm gonna stop. Thank you. Comments, questions? Yes.
So, 20 years or so ago, excuse me, Emory University invited a Church of England clergyman to speak at Emory. He also spoke at Agnes Scott. He had been the dean of Liverpool Cathedral, among other things. And before that, he had been a professor of mathematical physics at Cambridge University, knighted by the Queen for his contributions to physics. And then he became an Anglican clergyman. You may have met him. His name was John Polkinghorne.
Oh, yeah. I've not met him, but yes, the name.
He was known as Reverend Sir John Polkinghorne, which you gotta love. But so he spoke at Agnes Scott, and I heard this is in relation to the word hope. So, and I don't remember the speech, but I remember some of the Q&A afterwards. So somebody in the audience after his talk at Agnes Scott asked him if he believed, as a physicist, does he believe in the doctrine of the resurrection of the body? And he said, well, I prefer the term hope over the term belief. And it's the Christian hope that at the end of time, the mind of God will remember the arrangement of atoms and molecules in your body and resurrect it. That's the Christian hope. Mm-hmm. And then he went on to say, well, and then of course the question is, which body? The infant body, the aged body, some idealized, but whatever. But I was so struck by that, and I remember it to this day. He was talking about Christian hope,
Yes.
as opposed to belief.
Yeah. I think it's a reflection, especially of this understanding of hope as expectation. Yeah, I wanted to mention that. Yes.
I was having a kind of deep conversation last night with a good friend, and we were struggling with the idea that in a few weeks we'll have this big election. And I don't want to take sides. I know my side, most people know it. But I decided that the only way I could get through it, of it going another way, not my way, would be with hope. That was the only thing that was going to get me through the next 40 years, or and I just hold to that.
Yeah. I'm with you. I'm with you. It's important to me to, and this is something I say early on in the book, is that I think we fail the past when we have concluded that we're living in the worst of times.
Sure, I think about that a lot.
So how have our ancestors, how have we and our ancestors lived through worse times, or terrible times, horrific times? And how will we respond? How will we live through the time to come? And I think it's really crucial for us to be asking this question about the meaning of hope, whether we have an outcome that disappoints us or an outcome that pleases us. Because the work of hope is not addressed with whoever loses or whoever wins. And there are 1,000 matters that merit our attention in some form or fashion that will not be addressed by the person we're supporting, but need to be addressed. And how are we transformed and empowered and sustained in being about that work? Yes, thank you.
I feel like one of the strongest elements of the book is the kind of ongoing depth of practice that you're calling us to. And it's you've given us a kind of cheat sheet, okay, to keep your back strong. 25 sit-ups. But I think about the power of that long-term practice. It's a consciousness of what the pieces are, the chapters, but there's some consciousness of the practice, as you say, you're don't know when you're not praying. That's a level of engagement with the Holy. I'm stunned too about Luther, like how many times you actually say out loud the word God. It's a little unsettling. So I think there's something about this book for me and for us that is a kind of depth call. That sounds so pragmatic.
To respond to something Bobby has said, and then I'd like to just read a section. And
That sounds good.
okay.
Before you do that.
Okay. This matter of God, it was really important for me to recognize how using the term God was not definitive. It's expressive of something, but it isn't putting God in a box. Because there's, whenever, to even use the word God is the effort to speak about, to characterize a dimension of reality that is experienced and so much more than what I've experienced, is grasped by the ancestors and so much more than the ancestors grasped, is in some way captured in liturgy and so much more than what is expressed in liturgy. And so important to the convictions and values, and so much more than my convictions and values. You know, William James uses this term more as he's speaking about God in varieties of religious experience. But it's a very helpful term to both understand what it means to have a sense of presence and a sense of obligation and respect and responsiveness, and to use even the term in the Muslim faith for Islam itself, a sense of submission that is not like the way in which submission has been often used in situations of abuse and control and dominance, but freedom. And there is, for me, a kind of assurance and freedom and liberation in understanding this ever-present, loving presence of God, which for me, it's not, I have friends who are atheists, I have friends who are agnostics, I have friends who have a different Christology than me, who think of God differently. So it's not a matter of trying to convert everyone to a place that is where I am, but it is a matter for me of the the word humility, which is one of the most difficult of all the virtues, so much so that Fénelon had it at the end. And what is so often thought about humility is it's a diminishment of the sense of self and importance. Okay, that's like love and hope. Yeah, that's a particular understanding. But to me, one of the most significant understandings of the word humility is groundedness. To be grounded. Rootedness, groundedness. And I know the terrain on which I'm grounded. And it's a terrain that, for me, is subject to revision, subject to revelation, but not in terms of the very nature in which I'm grounded, as much as my reading on the particulars as to what that means. This is how theology changes significantly. This is how, we live. That there's an open-heartedness that characterizes, for me, this relationship with God. Yes, question, and then I'll read.
I just wanted to thank you for the invitation to really contemplate the journey with God as one that we really need to examine what's necessary and not, and to re-examine what we think might be essential, and to put it in terms of 4 big suitcases and 4 small ones. But this idea that, especially, that sometimes our own petitions and desires and hopes and dreams might be getting in the way of what God's calling us to do and to be.
Right.
And,
Yeah.
but thank you for that.
We normally think of hope as the fulfillment of our wishes, but I'm speaking often that hope is also disruptive. It takes us to places, it offers to take us to places, and sometimes it takes us to places that is calling forth something new and different than I'm prepared for at this particular place and time. And it's this disruption that is, I think, essential to beloved community. There are really good people who do not want things to change. And how might there be a kind of engagement where we begin to understand how disruption may be more for us than simply placing us in a kind of chaos or feeling as if the center has no longer held and we're falling apart. It's the work of hope is, I think when the work of hope is to disrupt, the work of hope is also to provide healing and a firmer foundation than we had. And it's going to be especially challenging for us who are doing, I think, some thoughtful things, or maybe we've retreated from doing some thoughtful things, but we're not doing bad things. It's going to be especially challenging for us to decide to be rethinking our habits, because we can not only become accustomed to our habits, we rely on them to the point at which I don't want to think about. Ellen Ott Marshall has written a book about how we bring our children up. And I think it's important. Soccer games, the various places that kids want to be, driving, schoolwork, showing up at all of that's important. But how might there be a need to not just think of those roles as the kind of parenting that is forming not only children, but the whole household for this journey? And this is where some parents have decided, we are going to have relationships with L'Arche, which is a community of persons with intellectual disabilities. And I served on the national board of L'Arche for 12 years. And I've been in these L'Arche communities where small kids are relating to people with intellectual disabilities who don't speak hardly, or who have these odd behaviors, or who have childlike behaviors. And they are at ease in this community. And I'm thinking, this child is growing up recognizing how diverse people are without stigmatizing in such a way as to somehow to be afraid. How might we, there was a parental choice that was made. And some parents have made it in terms of serving those who are homeless, unhoused, in terms of exposure and other realities of the world. It seems to me that sort of disruption of the habits in which maybe 95% of those participating in can be creative for us in terms of beloved community. This is in the epilogue, the end of the epilogue with which I leave you. Not as the world, no. Even with the promise that hope is here, the demands of the journey can intimidate us. We could give ourselves to scaling down the vision to something less challenging, but this is not how God dreams the vision. We recognize that the responsibilities for beloved community will consume our time and energy. Not only will our priorities and behaviors change, but we will change. The enormity of this sacred purpose can trigger our emotions. Uncertainty and anxiety evoke questions about the quest. Are we able and willing to give what is necessary to the transformative journey? Does God overestimate our capacities? Are there enough of us? The questions and our anxiety would be especially understandable if the journey were taken without God and God's forces of hope and love. However, this is not our plight, whether we affirm God or not. This is not our plight. God journeys with us. We should know what that means. If we do not know, be assured that the journey will answer our hearts. The urgency for justice and beloved community is here and now. The efforts needed for the transformation exceed the limits of my body. Still, I see the signs of hope all around me, and I am emboldened to persevere even as I see the enormity of the challenges. In this time, on this journey, so many challenges and so many opportunities are mine and yours. I anticipate continuing the journey with you. I know that our fellowship on the journey will make a difference for us and for our being a sign for so many others. I also know that however large our fellowship becomes, it alone will not be enough. What comforts and reassures me is knowing that the abiding presence and love of God on our journey is more than enough. The spiritual wisdom of Victor Hugo speaks to my heart, and I believe every heart, to help us sustain our activism in all the coming days. Courage, then, and patience. Courage for the great sorrows of life, and patience for the small ones. And when you have laboriously come to the end of your daily task, Go to sleep in peace. God is awake. Thank you.
We appreciate this book. Commend you to purchase the book. It's phenomenal. Thank you so much. Yeah, have a lovely afternoon. And feel free to think about it. If you guys know, Victor's time frame is also moving.
That's that all we have time.
I know.